Every century produces artists. Most of them work within the language of their time, refining it, extending it, making it more precise or more beautiful. They are essential. They are worth knowing. And in 100 years, their names appear in the footnotes of books about someone else. And then, very rarely, someone arrives who doesn't refine the language, who destroys it, and builds something new from the rubble. Pablo Picasso was that kind of artist. He didn't just change painting. He changed the way every human being who came after him was capable of seeing the world. The visual grammar he invented, fractured, simultaneous, multiple perspectives occupying the same space at the same time, is now so embedded in how we process images that we absorb it without noticing. In advertising, in film, in graphic design, in the way a smartphone camera breaks a face into data points, Picasso is everywhere. And most people who encounter him daily have no idea he's there. He was also, by the testimony of almost everyone who loved him, genuinely difficult to love. He was brilliant and manipulative, generous and cruel, capable of a tenderness that left people undone, and a coldness that left them destroyed. He consumed people, men, women, collaborators, rivals, with the same appetite he brought to canvas, and he rarely looked back. This is not a story about whether Picasso was a good person. That question has a clear enough answer, and the answer is complicated. This is a story about what he made and what it cost the world, what it cost the people around him, and what it cost him. Because Picasso paid too, not in the way his lovers paid, not in the way his children paid, but in the specific, invisible way that people pay when they are constitutionally unable to stop working, constitutionally unable to be satisfied, and constitutionally unable to believe that what they have already done is enough. This is Art and Ashes. Stay with me. This one is complicated, and it's worth every minute. Before we begin, subscribe if you're new here. Leave a comment telling us where you're listening from and what brought you to a story about Picasso at this hour. Every comment gets read, every one. To understand Pablo Picasso, you have to begin not in Paris, where the myth was made, but in Málaga, a port city on the southern coast of Spain, in a country that in 1881 was still trying to understand what it was supposed to be. Pablo Diego José Francisco de Paula, Juan Nepomuceno María de los Remedios, Cipriano de la Santísima Trinidad Ruiz y Picasso, was born on October 25th, 1881. He would eventually use only one name, his mother's. His father, José Ruiz Blasco, was a painter and art teacher, a competent and dedicated man whose specialty was academic painting in the tradition of the 19th century. Careful, technically accomplished, committed to representing the visible world, with fidelity and decorum. He painted pigeons. He taught drawing at the local school of fine arts. He was, by every account, a kind and gentle man who understood very quickly that his son was going to become something he himself could barely imagine. The story told about José Ruiz, probably embellished but rooted in something real, is that one afternoon when Pablo was around 13, he watched his son finish a painting of a pigeon and recognized, with the particular clarity of a person confronting something they cannot deny, that the boy had already surpassed him, that he would never catch up, that the gap was not one of experience or technique, but of something else entirely, something that could not be taught and could not be earned. The story goes that he handed Pablo his palette and his brushes and said he would never paint again. Whether or not those exact words were spoken, the emotional truth of the story is accurate. José Ruiz understood what he had produced, and he spent the rest of his life making sure it had every opportunity to become what it was capable of becoming. Pablo was, by every account, extraordinary from the beginning, not in the diffuse general way that family legend attributes to every gifted child, but in a way that was specific and observable and slightly unsettling. He could draw before he could speak in complete sentences. His childhood drawings, some of which survive, have the confident, purposeful line of a person who already knows exactly what they want to say and has found the means to say it. What he did not have was any interest in the academic conventions that his father taught and represented, the rules of perspective, the hierarchy of genres, the correct way to represent a human figure, the established subjects of serious painting. None of this interested him, except as a set of constraints to be mastered and then broken. He mastered them first. This matters enormously, and it is the thing that separates Picasso's destruction of convention from mere ignorance of it. He could draw with the technical perfection of a 19th century academician before he was 15 years old. The figure studies he produced as a student are more accomplished than the work of most professional painters twice his age. He understood the rules completely, and then he decided they were insufficient. The family moved several times during Pablo's adolescence, to La Coruña, then to Barcelona. Following José Ruiz's teaching appointments, it was Barcelona that changed everything. Barcelona in the 1890s was unlike any other city in Spain. It was industrial, cosmopolitan, politically restless, and culturally ambitious in a way that Madrid, the official capital, the seat of the court, found vaguely threatening. Catalan nationalism was building. Anarchism had real intellectual presence. The artistic and literary avant-garde of France and the rest of Europe arrived here before it reached the rest of Spain. Pablo enrolled at the School of Fine Arts, the La Llotja, and passed the entrance examination in a single day, the exam that students were typically given a month to complete. He was 14. But the school itself was less important to his formation than a café on the Carrer Nou de la Rambla called Els Quatre Gats, the Four Cats. Els Quatre Gats was the gathering point for Barcelona's bohemian and intellectual class. Painters, writers, architects, musicians, political radicals, and anyone else who felt that the 19th century's answer to the question of what art was for was entirely inadequate. It was modeled on the Parisian cabarets, specifically Le Chat Noir, and it functioned as a laboratory for the ideas that would eventually reshape European art and culture. Pablo walked in as a teenager and immediately became a fixture. He had his first solo exhibition there in 1900, a series of portraits of the cafe's regulars, drawn with a speed and confidence that made people stop mid-conversation to look. He was 18 years old. Later that year, he went to Paris for the first time. He went for the World's Fair, which was exhibiting a painting he had submitted, Last Moments, a large canvas of a deathbed scene, in the dark, atmospheric style of Spanish academic painting. The painting has since been lost. Picasso painted over it, which tells you most of what you need to know. about how he came to feel about this period of his work. But the trip to Paris was not lost. He saw the Louvre. He saw Toulouse-Lautrec's posters on the walls of the city. He saw the Impressionists. He saw Van Gogh. He saw a city where art was not a polite cultural activity, but a live argument about the nature of reality, urgent, unresolved, and conducted at full volume in cafes and studios, at all hours of the night. He went back to Barcelona, and then he went back to Paris, and then back to Barcelona again. And finally, in 1904, he moved to Paris permanently. He was 22 years old. He had almost no money. He spoke almost no French, and he moved into a ramshackle building in Montmartre that its residents called the Bateau Lavoir, the laundry barge, because it creaked and swayed in the wind like a boat at anchor. The Bateau Lavoir was, in the first decade of the 20th century, the most important address in the history of modern art. But before Paris and the revolution that would come, there was a period that those who study Picasso's work approach with a particular kind of attention, not because it produced his greatest work. It didn't, but because it produced his most human work, the work in which the distance between the painter and what he was painting was at its smallest. In February of 1901, Picasso's closest friend, a young Catalan painter named Carles Casagemas, shot himself in a Paris cafe in front of the woman he loved, who did not love him back. He was 20 years old. Picasso had known him since they were teenagers. They had traveled to Paris together for the first time. They had shared studios and meals in the particular intimacy of two young men who believe they are going to change the world and have not yet discovered how much it costs. The death of Casagemas did something to Picasso that his work makes visible with an honesty he rarely permitted himself again. The Blue Period began. From 1901 to 1904, Picasso painted almost exclusively in shades of blue and blue-green. Cold, melancholic, nocturnal. His subjects were the people the rest of Paris preferred not to see. Beggars, prisoners, prostitutes, the blind, the hungry, the old and forgotten. Figures that inhabit the edges of a city's life. Present but unwanted. Visible but unseen. He had almost no money himself during this period. He burned his own drawings for heat in his studio. He knew from the inside what it felt like to be cold and ignored in a city that was simultaneously the most beautiful and the most indifferent in Europe. The Blue Period paintings are not fashionably sad. They are not the melancholy that wealthy people perform to prove they are sensitive. They are paintings made by someone who had looked at grief directly, his own and other people's, and found that blue was the only color honest enough to contain it. The Old Guitarist, painted in 1903, now in the Art Institute of Chicago, shows a blind old man hunched over a guitar, his body a geometry of angles and deprivation. The blue is cold enough to feel like winter. The figure is so reduced, so stripped of everything except the instrument and the posture of someone who has nothing left except the music, that it is almost an abstraction. Almost, but not quite. The hands are too specific. The tension in the fingers is too real. The Blue Period ended when his circumstances changed, when he met Fernande Olivier, the first of many women who would become central to his life and his work, when he began to sell, when the isolation of the early Paris years gave way to the community that the Bateau Lavoir became. The Rose Period that followed Warmer, more lyrical, populated by acrobats and circus performers and harlequins, is often described as happier. It is more comfortable. Whether it is happier is a different question. The Bateau Lavoir in the years around 1905 and 1906 was home to a concentration of talent that has no real parallel in the history of modern art. The poet Guillaume Apollinaire, the writer Gertrude Stein, who became Picasso's patron and one of the most acute observers of his work, the painter Juan Gris, the sculptor Constantin Brancusi, and a young painter from Normandy named Georges Braque, who would become the other half of the most important artistic collaboration of the 20th century. But before Braque, before Cubism, before the Revolution, there was an encounter that Picasso himself said changed everything he thought he knew about art. In 1906, Picasso visited the Ethnographic Museum at the Trocadero in Paris. The museum housed a collection of African and oceanic objects, masks, figures, ritual objects that had been brought to France through the mechanisms of colonialism and were displayed with the casual condescension that the era brought to everything it did not understand. Picasso was disturbed by the visit. He said so explicitly years later. He described a feeling of confronting something that was more powerful than anything he had seen in European art, a visual logic that was not interested in representing the world as the eye sees it, but in capturing something beneath appearance, something structural, something essential, something that European painting, for all its technical sophistication, had never attempted. He spent weeks in his studio afterward, working on a painting he had been struggling with for months, going back to it, destroying sections and rebuilding them. His friends who visited the studio during this period found him agitated, secretive, and reluctant to show what he was doing. In the spring of 1907, he showed it. The painting was eventually titled Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. It depicts 5 female figures, the women of a brothel on a street in Barcelona, in a composition that violates virtually every convention of Western painting simultaneously. The space is fractured. The figures are presented from multiple viewpoints at once. A face shown in profile whose eye faces forward. A body shown from the front whose back is simultaneously visible. 2 of the figures wear masks that echo the African objects Picasso had seen at the Trocadero. Angular, non-naturalistic, visually aggressive. The perspective that European painting had used to create the illusion of 3-dimensional space since the 15th century is simply absent. There is no coherent space. There is only surface. And on that surface, 5 women who look back at the viewer with an aggression and directness that no painted figure in the Western tradition had previously permitted itself. The reaction of Picasso's friends was not enthusiasm. Braque said the painting made him feel as if someone had drunk gasoline and was breathing fire. The dealer, Ambroise Vollard, was baffled. Matisse, who was at that moment the most celebrated avant-garde painter in Paris, and who considered himself a friend of Picasso's, said it was an outrage, an attempt to ridicule modern art, a painting that would bring disgrace on everyone associated with it. Apollinaire loved it. Gertrude Stein said nothing for a long time, and then said it was important. Picasso put the painting against a wall in his studio and did not show it publicly for nearly a decade. He knew what he had made. He didn't need anyone else to tell him, and he kept working. What happened between Picasso and Georges Braque in the years between 1908 and 1914 is one of the most intimate and most productive artistic collaborations in the history of Western art. They worked so closely together, showing each other work in progress every day, responding to each other's solutions, building on each other's discoveries, that there are paintings from this period that neither man could later identify as his own. Picasso described them as two climbers roped together on a mountain. Neither one, he said, could have gone where they went, alone. What they invented was Cubism. Cubism is one of those words that has been so thoroughly absorbed into the general vocabulary of art that it has lost the power to shock. The paintings look, to a contemporary eye, like a recognizable style, geometric, fragmented, brown and gray and ochre, intellectually rigorous. They hang in museums next to the art they made obsolete, and they look like part of a continuous tradition. They were not part of a continuous tradition. They were the end of one tradition and the beginning of another. What Picasso and Braque were attempting to do was paint not what the eye sees, but what the mind knows, to represent an object, a bottle, a guitar, a human face, not from a single fixed viewpoint in a single frozen moment, but simultaneously from multiple viewpoints across time, in a way that captured not the appearance of the thing, but the experience of knowing it. This sounds like a philosophical proposition. It was, but it was also a practical one. When you look at a face, you do not see it from one angle in one instant. You see it over time, from different distances, in different lights, at different emotional temperatures. Your understanding of that face is built from thousands of partial encounters, accumulated into something more complete than any single photograph could contain. Picasso wanted to paint that accumulated understanding, not the snapshot, the knowledge. The early Cubist paintings, the analytic Cubism phase, roughly 1908 to 1912, are among the most austere and demanding works in the history of modern art. They are almost monochromatic, grays and browns and muted ochres, because color was considered a distraction from the structural problem that Picasso and Braque were trying to solve. They are dense with visual information that requires sustained attention to decode. They reward that attention, but they do not make it easy. The later phase, synthetic Cubism from around 1912 onward, was more playful, more colorful, and more radical in a different way. Picasso and Braque began incorporating actual objects into the paintings: newspaper clippings, wallpaper, sand, cloth. Collage entered art. The boundary between the represented world and the physical world was no longer where it had always been. This sounds technical. What it actually meant was that after Picasso and Braque, no painter could ever again innocently assume that a painting was a window onto the world. It was an object in the world, made of material, constructed, argued into existence. The illusion was over. In August of 1914, the First World War began. Braque was called up immediately. He was French and was severely wounded at the front in 1915. He recovered, but the intimacy of the collaboration was never quite restored. Two climbers roped together on a mountain, and then the rope cut. Picasso was Spanish, and Spain was neutral. He did not go to war, and the world he had shared with Braque, the Bateau Lavoir, the cafes of Montmartre, the community of artists who had been building something together, was dispersed by the war and never quite reassembled. What came next in Picasso's work is one of the things that most surprises people who know him only as the inventor of Cubism. He went classical. In the years after the First World War, Picasso produced a series of large figurative paintings, monumental, serene, painted in the warm ochres and blues of the Mediterranean, that look, at first glance, like the work of a completely different artist. Figures derived from ancient Greek and Roman sculpture, massive, calm bodies, a world of formal order and mythological resonance. That has nothing obvious to do with the fractured geometries of the Cubist decade. This was not a retreat. It was an expansion. Picasso did not abandon Cubism. He continued to produce Cubist work throughout this period, but he refused to be defined by it. He refused to be the artist who had done one great thing and spent the rest of his career refining it. He needed, constitutionally, to keep moving. He had married Olga Koklova, a Russian ballerina from Diaghilev's ballet Russes, in 1918. The marriage brought him into a world of bourgeois elegance and social ambition that was completely at odds with the Bateau Lavoir years. They had a son, Paolo, in 1921. They lived in apartments in the best arrondissements. Picasso wore well-cut suits. He was also, during these years of apparent domestic stability, meeting a 17-year-old girl named Marie-Thérèse Walter on a street outside the Galeries Lafayette in Paris. He was 45. He introduced himself. He told her she had an interesting face and that he would like to paint it. He told her that she didn't know who he was, but that she would. He told her they were going to do great things together. He was right, about the last part at least, but the great things were not evenly distributed between them. Marie-Thérèse Walter became his secret companion for 7 years, secret from Olga, secret from the art world, known only to the paintings he made of her, which are among the most sensually alive works he ever produced. The curves of the portraits he made of her are not like any other curves in Picasso's work. Softer, more generous, lit from within by something that the formal language of Cubism had never been designed to contain. She bore him a daughter, Maya, in 1935. He did not leave Olga for her. He never married her, and she waited with a patience and a devotion that Picasso consistently mistook for bottomlessness until she had waited long enough. Marie-Thérèse Walter died in 1977, 4 years after Picasso's death, by her own hand. She was 68 years old. There are several ways to think about Picasso's relationships with women. None of them are comfortable. His biographers have described him variously as a man who genuinely loved the women he was with and was constitutionally incapable of remaining faithful, as a man who used people as artistic raw material and discarded them when the material was exhausted, and as a man whose personal cruelty was inseparable from the creative intensity that made him what he was. The women themselves have spoken. Françoise Gillot, who was with Picasso for 9 years, bore him 2 children, and was one of the very few women in his life who left him rather than being left, wrote a memoir that is one of the most valuable accounts of Picasso's personality and working methods that exists. She described him as someone who required, from everyone around him, a constant supply of attention and admiration that was never quite enough, who was generous and devastating in roughly equal measure, who saw other people, including people he loved, primarily in relation to himself. She also described the work, the daily discipline of it, the way the studio was the center of everything, the place where everything else in his life either fed or was discarded, the way he could work for 12 hours without stopping and emerge from the studio with the specific electric quality of someone who has been somewhere no one else has access to. In April of 1937, German and Italian warplanes, deployed in support of Franco's fascist forces in the Spanish Civil War, bombed the Basque town of Guernica on a Monday afternoon, market day. The town was full of civilians. The bombing lasted for several hours. The planes came in waves. By the end, between 150 and 1,600 people were dead. The estimates vary because the chaos was too complete for accurate counting, and the town was destroyed. Picasso read about it in the newspapers. He had already been commissioned by the Spanish Republican government to produce a large painting for the Paris International Exhibition. He had been stalled, uncertain what to paint, unable to find a subject adequate to the political moment. And then Guernica happened, and he knew. He began the painting on May 1st, 1937. He finished it on June 4th, 35 days, for a canvas 11 feet tall and 25 feet wide. Guernica does not depict the bombing. There are no airplanes in it, no fire, no ruins. There is a screaming horse, a bull, unmoved and watching, a woman holding a dead child, a soldier's dismembered arm still gripping a broken sword, a figure falling from a burning building, a lamp thrust into the frame, a human arm holding an electric light above the chaos, like a witness that cannot look away. And everywhere, mouths open. The painting is full of open mouths, screaming, all of them screaming. The painting is in black and white and gray, like a newspaper, like a photograph from the scene, like something that happened and was recorded and cannot be denied. When a Nazi officer visited Picasso's studio in Paris during the German occupation and saw a photograph of Guernica on the wall, he asked, "Did you do that?" Picasso answered, "No, you did." The German occupation of Paris was the period that most clearly revealed the specific quality of Picasso's stubbornness. He could have left. Many of his friends did, to the south of France, to the United States, to anywhere that wasn't occupied. Picasso stayed in Paris. He worked every day. He was not physically harmed. His international fame was a kind of protection, and the Nazis preferred to ignore him rather than create the public relations problem that arresting the most famous living artist in the world would have generated. But he was not left alone entirely. The Gestapo visited his studio. His materials were restricted. His paintings could not be exhibited. And he was visited regularly by German officers who wanted to pay their respects to the great Picasso and perhaps take home a postcard of Guernica as a souvenir. He gave them postcards, and when they asked if they could have one, he said, "Take it. It's a souvenir." After the liberation of Paris in August 1944, Picasso joined the French Communist Party. He was 63 years old. His membership was, by most accounts, as much a gesture of solidarity with the French resistance and his murdered friends As it was a precise ideological commitment, he remained a member for the rest of his life, and his relationship with the party, like all his relationships, was complicated, occasionally embarrassing, and never entirely resolved. The decades after the war were the most productive of his extraordinarily productive life. He moved to the south of France, first to Vallauris, then to Cannes, then to Amas near Aix-en-Provence, then finally to Notre-Dame-de-Vie near Mougins, and worked with an intensity that those around him found, at this point in his life, both inspiring and slightly alarming. He was making ceramics, thousands of them, at the Madura pottery in Vallauris, transforming a medium he had never worked in. With the same appetite he had brought to everything else, he was making prints, linocuts, lithographs, etchings, in quantities that exhausted entire print workshops. He was painting every day, sometimes multiple paintings in a day, and producing work that ranged from the sublime to the deliberately ugly, to the playful, to the explicitly erotic. He was also doing something else, something that his critics found baffling and his admirers found fascinating. He was having conversations with the dead. Beginning in the late 1950s, Picasso produced a series of extended variations on paintings by the masters of the Western tradition: Velázquez's Las Meninas, Delacroix's Women of Algiers, Manet's Luncheon on the Grass. He would take a canonical painting, a work so established in the tradition that it had become a piece of visual furniture, seen so many times it was no longer truly seen, and produce dozens of variations on it, decomposing it, rebuilding it, arguing with it, playing with it, treating the masterpiece of a dead painter the way a jazz musician treats a standard, as a structure from which to improvise. The Las Meninas series, 58 paintings produced between August and December of 1957, is one of the most extraordinary sustained acts of creative dialogue in the history of art. Picasso takes Velázquez's painting apart and puts it back together in ways that reveal things about the original that 500 years of art historical attention had not fully articulated. He was 75 years old when he painted them. He produced 58 paintings in 4 months. He had been painting for over 60 years, and he was still learning. The last decade of Picasso's life is the part of the story that most biographies handle with a certain unease, because it doesn't fit cleanly into either the celebratory narrative of genius or the critical narrative of a man whose personal life demands a moral accounting. He was enormously famous, obscenely wealthy, living in a large house in the south of France with Jacqueline Roch, who had married him in 1961 and who devoted her life, with a totality that both protected and isolated him, to making sure he could work. He saw very few people in these final years. His children from previous relationships had difficulty getting access to him. His son Paolo, the son from his marriage to Olga, died in 1975, 2 years after Picasso himself. His grandson Pablito, who had not been allowed into the church for Picasso's funeral, killed himself 3 days after the old man died. These are not footnotes. They are part of the story. The question of what a life of total dedication to art costs the people who orbit that life does not have a comfortable answer in Picasso's case. It doesn't have a comfortable answer in most cases, but in Picasso's case, the scale is large enough. That looking away requires effort. On April 8, 1973, Pablo Picasso died at his home in Mougins. He was 91 years old. He had been working until very near the end. The last paintings he made, large, raw, painted with a speed and urgency that art historians have spent decades interpreting, suggest a man in conversation with his own mortality, in the only language he had ever fully trusted. He had produced, over the course of his life, approximately 13,500 paintings, 100,000 prints and engravings, 34,000 book illustrations, and 300 sculptures and ceramics. The numbers are so large, they become almost meaningless. What they add up to is a body of work, so vast and so varied that it constitutes, by itself, something like an entire history of modern art. The question people keep asking about Picasso, the question that follows every exhibition, every biography, every retrospective, is whether it's possible to separate the work from the man. The honest answer is no. It has never been possible. The work comes from the man. The man produced the work. The cruelty and the genius were not separate systems running in parallel. They were aspects of the same central fact, which is that Picasso was a person of extreme intensity, in every direction simultaneously. The same force that drove him to work every day for 70 years, drove him to consume the people around him. The same appetite that produced Guernica, produced the pattern of relationships, that destroyed several of the people closest to him. This is not a reason to stop looking at the work. It is a reason to look at it more carefully, to ask what it contains, to ask what it required, to ask whether the thing it gave the world was worth what it took from the world, knowing that no one who asks that question will ever agree on the answer, and knowing that the question itself is one of the things art is for. What Picasso left behind, beyond the paintings and the sculptures and the prints, is a way of seeing that cannot be unlearned. Once you understand what Cubism was trying to do, once you understand that a face can be shown from multiple angles simultaneously, that time and space can be fractured and reassembled, that the painting is not a window but an argument, you cannot look at anything the same way again. Not a photograph, not a film, not a face across a table. The world he broke in half in 1907 was never put back together, and we see better for it, more honestly, more completely, with less comfortable illusion, and more productive uncertainty. Whether that is worth the cost, you'll have to decide for yourself. I hope this story kept you company tonight. If you've made it to the end, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. The curious, the patient, the people who choose depth over noise, at whatever hour it happens to be. This is Art and Ashes, your companion for late nights and long questions. If this story gave you something, leave a like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which Picasso, the grieving young man in blue, the revolutionary who broke painting in half, the old man still working at 90, feels most real to you? And tell us what story you want us to tell next. Every comment gets read. Thank you for listening. Until the next one.